Senator Frederick.
Mr. Speaker, honorable members, I rise to lend my voice to this most important debate. What a fantastic opportunity we, the Parliament of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, are being provided by the tabling of this legislation to really act, to put into sharp focus the situation that faces our women and our children in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. You might listen to the title, hear it, Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Bill, and say, well, this isn't really relevant to St. Vincent. We ain't trafficking no people. And I've had the opportunity to converse with many people who, when we started to talk about this among our peers, my colleague, Senator Batiste and I, just felt that we were being academic in talking about human trafficking. So does this really happen in St. Vincent? But if you look at the bill that is being proposed, the definition of trafficking is wide enough to cover situations and offenses that take place in St. Vincent and the Grenadines domestically that have nothing to do with getting people together and shipping them out in exchange for money. And that is what is so important about this piece of legislation. Because the Prime Minister has stood in this House this evening and said that the issues that are dealt with in this particular bill are not issues on which existing law is silent. And that's a sort of half-legal way of saying, yes, there's legislation out there. We do have legislation. We have domestic violence legislation. You know, we have legislation to protect children. Any individual can approach any court and say to any official there something that they know is happening to endanger a child or a woman in a vulnerable position, and the court is mandated to hear them and to empower the state to respond. But the reality is that implementation hampers sensible legislation. Enforcement hampers progressive legislation. And part of the reaction to being tier 2 on this watch list, part of having to react to that, has provided us with a great opportunity to, and let me borrow the word from the Honorable Prime Minister, in an omnibus fashion, tackle what the situation is facing the women and the girls in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Mr. Speaker, I am passionate about this. I am a woman, I am an attorney, and I have sat down in my office and cried tears with women who have had to make decisions to do sex acts for groceries because they see no way out. And that's not something to smile about. It's not a joke. It is the reality that some women face. And I am saying that I look forward to when this legislation will be tested in the court, to hold to account people who abuse their positions of authority and hold women in situations of subjugation. The mother who organizes for her underage or her of-age daughter to have sex with the landlord in place of them having to pay rent. That is not fiction. That is something that takes place in this country. I want to test this legislation and test it in tandem with existing legislation to make the state react positively to enforce against mothers who make the decision to put their daughters in that position on the basis of having the position of trust as parents. This legislation, to my mind, will hold such parents to account. Gone are the days when you hold somebody's salary over their heads in exchange for a little something on the side. So the boss who says that the job is open if certain things happen, and the woman who makes the assumption that what to do, I need a job. You see, I believe that what the United States and the other countries in the world who have projected human trafficking to the fore to this extent, what they have provided us with in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is an opportunity to really tackle these social issues that we never could pigeonhole under existing legislation. And what is important is enforcement. And to my mind, that is the greatest challenge. What did the Honorable Prime Minister just say? The absence of, well, he said that institutional supports are necessary. And I wrote that the absence of institutional supports sees the acts and the existing laws not being utilized in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And so that is the greatest pain. We support this legislation, but will it just end up being in the books? Mr. Speaker, there was a woman living in the hills somewhere in this country. I don't want to be too specific. She's blind. And she had a boyfriend who the neighbors said beat her. I was unclear as to whether they tried to report or didn't report or intervene to break up one fracas after the next. She was living in total squalor. You wouldn't put your animals where she was living. No water, no toilet, no floor, no rail roof, sleeping on a piece of board. When I saw her, she hadn't had a bath for maybe a week. She was hungry and I gave her what I had. You know, if I'd really thought about it, I would have taken more substantial. I didn't know what I was going to see when I got there. The attitude of the man who claimed to be her boyfriend was one of total aggression until he understood that the welfare department was there with the ambulance and a lawyer. So the cutlass that he was brandishing disappeared fast, fast, fast. This woman could not even string two sentences together. She was in a panic about the fact that she was being moved out of this situation. For fear. She was malnourished, she was scarred, and she was blind. And it was a permanent blindness that, if you listen to the neighbors, had something to do with being beaten. Now the state intervened, and they moved her to a clinic. And the nurses in the clinic did their best. But do you know what happened? 4 to 5 days after she's nourished and okay, back to the house. She couldn't open her mouth to say no, she wasn't going. She didn't feel empowered to get herself out of that situation. And guess what? The state felt unempowered as well. Because legislatively, they could not intervene to save a victim who was so cowed by her situation that she couldn't call for the legislation to help her. She couldn't be a typical virtual complainant giving a statement. She's a victim in need of serious psychological intervention. But here we have an impotent state system trying its best. But there comes a time when you must recognize that you have to up your game. And this legislation must empower the citizens of this country to ensure that the state ups its game and prioritizes our human resource, mental, spiritual, social health, ahead of some of the other concerns that we put higher on the pecking order. And that is not a piece of literature. That is a fact that I witnessed myself. That is what some people have to live in this country. So human trafficking is not only about securing your borders to ensure that they're not grabbing people and putting them on planes, sure. But it is about ensuring that you protect the vulnerable women living in situations of servitude. So I don't see this as a piece of legislation that is going to be applied without having regard for domestic violence legislation or other pieces of legislation that are there. But my great fear is that the incapacity of the state to give this legislation teeth would make it surely and solely only a decoration on our law books. Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation must be enforced after it is passed. We cannot wait 1, 2, 3, 5, 7 years before we do what is required to give it the teeth necessary. And so I'm inviting the citizenry, and this is not politics now. Every woman who is living in a situation where you're in servitude, where you're being exploited, and I know that this male-dominated house is saying men too, men too. I'm listening on both sides. I'm getting the talk on both sides. But I'm standing up here as one of 3 women, and I'm advocating for women now. Beg your pardon, 4 women, Madam AG. I'm advocating for women now. Because you see, too often in our parliaments, Mr. Speaker, we come and we say the academically correct, sounding nice things to say. And we make our position known in the most flowery language. But the problems facing women and girls in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which this piece of legislation can address, are problems that women are facing every day. So don't believe for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker, that this legislation is to salve the desires of the persons who put us on tier 2 watch lists. Say, well, okay, look, we did something. We have good legislation here. We have to make this good legislation mean something to the population. And I believe that it is the responsibility of this government to ensure that social services increases its capacity to make this legislation have teeth. The police service must no longer feel that it can say, that's man-woman thing, we not getting involved in that. In a situation that could well be something that fits under the human trafficking rubric provided for in the legislation. You know, I had a situation where a lady came to me saying that she was beaten and threatened with a cutlass I called the police. And the officer I spoke to said, Miss Frederick, you know, the gentleman came here to the police station and tell me she had to go with. And he chuckled. But the legislation exists for him to treat that offense a particular way as an offense under existing legislation. So the issue of enforcing legislation is not going to start with the Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Bill. It's an existing problem. But I am saying that this piece of legislation is too valuable to permit it to go a-begging, Mr. Speaker. It must be placed in tandem with existing legislation that speak to protecting women and girls particularly, to ensure that this parliament can say, and this government of which the opposition is a part, can say that something happened in St. Vincent and the Grenadines across political lines to secure women and girls in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I rise essentially to give my support, Mr. Speaker, to this piece of legislation, but to issue a challenge to the women and girls out there who are living lives mired with offenses against the person, sexual offenses, situations of servitude and exploitation, to come forward and make the state do its work to protect you. Because, as the Prime Minister quite rightly said, our human resource is what we have in this country. And we ensure that our women feel their value as credible members of this society, equally weighted in value as our male counterparts, Mr. Speaker, when we pass legislation, but not only when we pass the legislation, but when, as a government, we enforce it to secure the spirit of women and girls in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
Any other